Senator Omidvar.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak to Bill 217, the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act, which I will refer to as FARA. I have tabled this bill twice, and I hope the third time works like a charm. And I find myself again battling the dinner clock, and I will try my best to bring it in under. Before I begin to share the details of this bill with you, I would like to thank the institution that has come up with this proposal, and it is the World Refugee and Migration Council, which has tasked itself to be catalytic, to think of out-of-the-box solutions and face some of the most significant crisis in the world today, which is the crisis of the forcibly displaced people of the world, those who flee their countries for safety and those who are internally displaced because they cannot flee their country. I'm a terribly proud member of this council, along with noted academics, former heads of state, former ministers, Nobel Peace Prize winners, and activists. I would also like to take a moment to thank our former colleague, Senator Renelle Andrzejczyk. As we all know, she was the one who shepherded the Magnitsky Act through this chamber, through the House of Commons, and was called into law, and this bill rests on her shoulders and builds on it. In addition, in the last election, this proposal was included in the policy platform of the Conservative Party, as they recognized that it is one key way of dealing with corruption. The Liberal Party platform of 2018 also included it in their platform, and in fact, this was in the mandate letter of then Foreign Minister, Global Affairs Minister Champagne. If FARA is called into law, Canada will be able to seize the frozen assets of corrupt foreign officials held in Canada through court order and repurpose them back to alleviate the suffering of the people who have been harmed most by their action. In this way, it squares the circle. And why is this important? For one, the world is facing a forced displacement calamity. There are over 82 million people around the world. Half of them, colleagues, are children who have fled their homes because of armed conflict, violence, persecution, and human rights abuses. This is the second highest number of the forcibly displaced since the Second World War, and the numbers continue to rise daily. And their catastrophe, their lives, have created a significant strain, especially on those jurisdictions that border the places they flee from, and they themselves are challenged to meet the needs of their own citizens, let alone thousands of arriving refugees. Colleagues, I speak to this in part from personal experience. As someone who had to make the decision to leave a country and their home in the middle of the night, a decision to flee is never an easy one. It is fraught with peril, and frankly, it paralyzes you with fear. I can still remember what it was like to cross the border from Iran into Turkey in 1981. I can still smell the fear that was pervasive in the room that we were being processed through. It was our fear, of course, but there was also the fear that I sensed in the Revolutionary Guards who were surrounding us. But here is the difference. They were barely 14 or 15 years old, but they had weapons, and they had bayonets. And I think we all recognize what a toxic combination fear and weapons can be. I share this story with you once again, colleagues, because I want you, I need you to walk in the shoes of those people and feel their fear, feel their loss and their helplessness. I'm, of course, one of the lucky ones. I was able to come to Canada. I've had a productive life with my family. That is not always the case for the people who are forced to flee. The displaced people of today live in squalor. There is little food. Fresh water is scarce. Disease and danger lurks everywhere. Sex and human trafficking are growth industries, and resettlement, an option that Canada is rightfully proud of, only applies to a slim 10% of the world's refugee population. It is countries, colleagues, like Bangladesh with the Rohingya refugees, Uganda with the South Sudanese, or Colombia with the Venezuelans who are most at risk, and now Pakistan with Afghan refugees. All have opened their doors, some more than others, to let people in. But let's not forget that this has put an enormous strain on them, their communities, their economy, and their social fabric. In addition, let me note that forced displacement is no longer a temporary phenomenon. On average, it lasts 20 years. Whole generations of human beings knowing nothing more than living a protracted existence on the margins. Clearly, we need more money. But money for refugees is hard to come by. There is simply not enough money in the system. The UNHCR, as one example, is only ever able to reach 60% of its annual budget. These are not just numbers, but lives at risk. And yet, there's a whole lot of corrupt money floating around. Anyone who has read the news about the Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers, the Panama Papers, we know that corruption is a growth industry. The World Bank estimates that $20 billion to $40 billion in development assistance money is stolen by public officials every year. And according to the United Nations Secretary General, embezzlement, tax dodging, bribes, and payoffs worldwide cost roughly, hold on to your seats, $3.6 trillion every year. Even more pertinently, it is estimated that corrupt leaders of countries with large populations of refugees have deposited billions of dollars in cash and assets in foreign jurisdictions. It is reasonable to assume that, in fact, it is reasonable to be certain that some of this money is parked right here in Canada because of our reputation as a country with good financial governance. So how would this bill work? As I noted, Canada already has a number of sanction regimes that permit us to freeze the assets of corrupt foreign officials. The decision whether to take the next step and seek a court order for confiscation, which would repurpose the assets back to the victims, would be made exclusively by the Attorney General of Canada. Only the Attorney General or someone else with the AG's consent could make an application to a provincial superior court. How would the AG come to this decision? The AG would act on behalf of the government as a whole, would no doubt confer with his colleagues, the Minister of Global Affairs. Clearly, he or she would be informed by reports and documents, by lists of frozen assets that are already there from other reputable sources, journalists, academics, fact-finding missions, etc. The AG would then make an application to the court. The court would then decide, based on evidence, if the confiscation should proceed. The court would give notice, would hear witnesses, weigh evidence, including from representatives of the foreign official. The court would make a decision based on the balance of evidence. If the court decides that confiscation should proceed, then it would also, in the ruling, set out the criteria and the plan for the distribution of the assets. The court would decide to whom and how the assets should be distributed. Should they go back to the country of origin? Should they go to the UNHCR? Should they go to Médecins Sans Frontières or the World Bank? Should they, in fact, go to the neighboring country that is dealing with a massive influx of refugees? The court would also decide on the means to monitor the implementation of the order, thus providing accountability and transparency. Let me play this out in real life a little. Let's make it real. Canada has already frozen the assets of military generals in Myanmar who have committed a genocide against the Rohingya and forced 1 million people to flee to Bangladesh. Canada, through the court, would be able to confiscate their assets and repurpose them back to help the Rohingya who are currently in really dire, miserable situations in the refugee camps in Bangladesh. That would be the court's decision whether to repurpose the money to an NGO or to Bangladesh or to any other institution. There are other examples, but I will skip them. And I just want to speak very briefly to the principles of the bill. The first principle relates to accountability. Dictators, human rights abusers, kleptocrats have acted with impunity for far too long. They need to be held to account. They purloin the wealth of their nations, leaving a trail of victims in their wake. The second principle is justice, by seizing the ill-gotten gains and repurposing them back in support of those whose lives have been destroyed. I hope you will see the moral symmetry at play here. Actions have reactions, and there must be consequences. Without consequences, we are left with words full of sound and fury signifying possibly nothing. The third principle is due process, and the bill proposes that the seizure of assets of corrupt foreign officials take place through court order. Only a judge will decide, based on the balance of evidence provided to her or him, whether to proceed on the matter. Only a judge will decide whether the seized assets are returned to the source country or to another jurisdiction. This requirement adds transparency because the application and evidence will be public, the hearing will be open, and the results with reasons will be published. In addition, a court hearing will ensure that anyone who has a potential interest in the frozen asset can come before the court and make their case. And the fourth principle, an important one, is openness and transparency. Canadians and the public will know through a public registry not just the names of the corrupt officials, but also the value of their frozen assets. The fifth principle is compassion, but compassion with an edge, with a heavy dose of pragmatism. We can empathize and sympathize and use lofty words for all we like, but the displaced of the world need housing, they need safety, they need education, they need healthcare, they need food, they need water. All of this comes with a cost. And the UNHCR, we know, is not able to meet the growing demand with the growing numbers of displaced people. By repurposing stolen money back to those who have suffered the most, this bill will create a new source of financing to provide urgently needed resources for the victims of this unfortunate phenomena. This is compassion, but linked to action. Finally, this bill is about good governance. Canada should not and must not be a safe haven for ill-gotten gains. In this chamber, we are looking at other avenues of hidden corrupt money. This bill sends a strong message to corrupt leaders. You and your money are not welcome in this country. This is not a place where you can hide it or grow it. Colleagues, some of you have asked whether the courts are in fact the right vehicle for this bill. To that, I offer two responses. First, the courts have the expertise to deal with such matters. The courts are regularly called upon to deal with issues of asset confiscation, albeit in different circumstances. Currently, the courts oversee the confiscation and distribution of proceeds of crime from drug cartels, gangs, or other criminals. My second observation about the inclusion of the court is that the involvement of the courts will guarantee openness, impartiality, and fairness. The courts are well positioned to be the principal actors in this bill. Some of you will be thinking of the million-dollar question that we are always faced. Does this legislation conform to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Let me quote.
Sorry to interrupt you, Senator Omidvar.
That's the battle with time.
It seems lately you've been in conflict with the 6 o'clock rule, but you will be given the balance of your time. Omidvar.
Thank you, Chair. Colleagues, I sadly lost the challenge to the dinner clock, but I hope I have moved your hearts and minds. We were at the spot where I was talking about charter challenges and constitutionality, so let me pick it up from there, but to briefly reconfirm what I have said, because my memory is frail, and if you're like me, your memory is frail too. So my bill will seek to seize frozen assets and repurpose them back through court order to victims of corruption, in particular victims of mass human rights violations and forced displacement. So the question really is this charter-proof? Let me quote from a policy paper published on this particular question by the World Refugee and Migration Council, which was prepared by a noted lawyer, no less than former Attorney General of Canada and former Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations, Alan Rock. He says, the section of the Charter that could potentially be invoked to attack frozen assets and confiscation is Section 7, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And although this section is held by the courts to be very broad, the jurisprudence has also made it clear that Section 7 generally does not protect and apply to economic rights of the applicant. This is further underlined by Justice Garnier, who ruled in a case involving the freezing of the assets of former President Ben Ali of Tunisia. And she noted, generally, neither the right to hold employment nor the economic interests of the applicant are protected by the Charter. And the paper concludes on this point by saying, it is unlikely that an applicant would be successful in challenging Canadian legislation providing for the freezing and confiscation of the assets of a corrupt foreign officials on the grounds that it contravenes the Charter. I would like to point out, finally, another very important aspect of this bill. Currently, we do not know the value of the assets that have been frozen in Canada. We know the names of the individuals, but we actually do not know whether they have any assets in Canada. There is no public transparency since the government is not yet obliged to provide this information. This bill will raise the curtain, make it less opaque, and compel the government to list not only corrupt foreign officials, but also to provide the value of their assets. In the absence of this information, Canadians are not able to advocate for confiscation and opportunities to achieve the benefits that I'm talking about. Finally, and I'm glad I have the time to actually talk about this a little bit more, this legislation is not unique, colleagues. We are following best practice from, guess where? Switzerland, the home originally of all assets held by all kinds of people in secrecy forever. In 2015, Switzerland, for good reason to clean up its reputation, enacted the Foreign Illicit Assets Act. Under that law, Swiss government can apply to their federal court to confiscate foreign assets. And if granted, Switzerland can send the assets to the country of origin or another entity for the purpose of improving the lives and conditions of the inhabitants of the country and supporting the rule of law in the country, thus contributing to the fight against corruption. And they in fact, repurposed assets, stolen assets, back to, I think, Kazakhstan by court order, and used a foundation to provide education for children in Kazakhstan. Both the United Kingdom and France are currently looking at similar legislation. And the EU, which recently enacted Magnitsky, is also looking at this legislation as the next step in their fight against corruption. And this brings me to the final reason why I believe this legislation is important. If Canada succeeds in passing it, I believe that others will follow. We followed the example of the US in calling the Magnitsky Act into life, and former Senator Ondrzejczak improved on the US version once it came to Canada. The same narrative may well follow this act. This bill, I believe, will ignite the imagination of other jurisdictions by providing a concrete example of how individual jurisdictions can act. Others will pick up and improve on it, and Canada will be the leader, the transformative leader. In conclusion, colleagues, for far too long, corrupt foreign officials have acted with impunity. They have not only stolen mass wealth, but have created significant hardship for their people. Their actions have contributed to the displacement and misery of millions of people. Calling them out is simply not enough. We have to make them pay, and FARA will accomplish precisely that. Thank you, colleagues.
Senator Duncan.
Thank you, Your Honour. I move the adjournment of the debate until the next sitting of the Senate.
I'm sorry, could we just hold for a moment, Senator Duncan? I didn't see Senator Dalphond rising from his seat. Senator Dalphond.
Senator, take a question.
Senator Dalphond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I might be speaking from there, but I speak the same brain and the same mouth. Sorry. If I understand properly what you said, you propose we deal with these assets the same way we deal with what we call the proceeds of criminal act in Canada, not in the criminal proceedings, but in a kind of civil proceedings, where it's balance of probability and not the higher level of evidence which is required, and that we confiscate, and the judiciary will here give an opportunity to everybody to speak, and then the assets will be handed over to an organization that the court will decide based on whatever the Crown or somebody, the Attorney General, will propose. So I must say that I've been involved as a judge in cases where we had the seizures of criminal money, and it's often more effective than criminal actions because we take the money, we take the property, we take all the things, the gold and the jewelry, whatever, and that hurts. And I certainly support your bill. I think it's a great opportunity to go at criminals that are living beyond our jurisdictions, but have assets here. And as you said, if it's corruption, it's a crime. So if a crime was committed, it's a criminal process. It's the process of a crime. So if I understand very well, that you will propose a kind of civil proceedings similar to what we have for criminal money, I certainly support that. Thank you.
Senator Omidvar?
Thank you, Senator Dalphon. I always dread questions from the lawyers in the room because I'm not a lawyer. But this one I'm grateful for because you got it completely right. It is not a criminal court proceeding, but an administrative court. And thank you so much for your support. I hope you will help me pass this and get it to committee so we can very quickly, hopefully to Foreign Affairs, get witnesses and discuss this and bring this back to the chamber. So thank you.